Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor. On this week's show, Boris Johnson is still in a perilous position. The Prime Minister is being pressured on three fronts. His ethics advisor has just resigned, he's fighting back against the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the government is trying to implement a controversial Rwanda plan. I'll be joined by our politics team James Forsyth and Katie Bors to discuss it all. Are liberal democracies suffering crises of leadership around the world? The Spectator's deputy editor Freddy Gray argues so in this week's cover article, and he'll be joining us. We'll then talk about one of those democracies, France. Macron may be one of the liberal leaders in the strongest position for now, but he's fending off a challenge from the left. I'll be joined by Jean-Ric MacArthur, president of Harper's magazine, and French journalist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. We'll also be taking a look at the supposed Rolls-Royce of the British civil service. Is it time to break up the Treasury? Economists Davies and Gerard Lyons will join me. And finally, has artificial intelligence already become sentient? Google engineers have released a conversation they had with an AI, which is somewhat disturbing. The Spectator's Sam Leith and the philosopher Julian Savulescu will join the show. Before we get going, why not subscribe to The Spectator? You can get 12 weeks of The Spectator in print and online for just £12, and we'll send you a copy of Douglas Murray's new book, The War on the West, absolutely free. Subscribe today at spectator.co.uk/book. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel too? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of the video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Boris Johnson is desperately trying to regain control of the political agenda after a rocky few weeks. The PM's ethics advisor has just resigned, the government has said that it will unilaterally abandon some parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it's trying to keep alive its Rwanda deportation plan for refugees. It's not an easy week, but are some of these fights actually good for the government? To explain, I'm joined by Katie Bors and James Forsyth. James, let's start with the resignation of Lord Geit, the government's ethics advisor. It's the second that Boris Johnson has had so far. At the moment of recording, we still don't know what the full resignation letter is saying because the government is refusing to publish it. So do we know what was the last straw for Lord Geit?
So we know that the resignation letter will be published later on today. I think people will be reading that with great interest. Downing Street put out this very curious statement last night saying that he had been asked to advise on a commercially sensitive matter in the national interest. And I think that left people very puzzled. I think what is quite clear is that Lord Geit has been frustrated for some time. First of all, he was put in charge of looking into this whole issue of the redecoration of a Downing Street flat. And then once Lord Geit had concluded his inquiry, further messages came to light that Lord Geit then had to kind of respond to and that put him in an extremely awkward position. We also know from the annual update from him that he was extremely irritated that the Prime Minister hadn't explained how he didn't think that getting a fixed penalty notice was why he thought that was consistent with his obligations under the Ministerial Code to uphold the law. And then there was an extremely difficult time in front of a parliamentary select committee this week for Lord Geit. And he would only be human if he decided that he'd had enough. And I mean, the problem for Boris Johnson is he's now lost two ethics advisors. Lord Geit was quite clear that the changes to the role were at a low end of ambition. And I think it is very hard to see how Boris Johnson is going to persuade anyone to do this job unless they are given the power to initiate investigations of their own accord.
I mean, Katie, after last week's no confidence vote, it does seem like Boris Johnson had temporarily stabilised the situation with his own position. Do you think this is going to move the dial again?
Well, I think in a way this has come at an okay time for Boris Johnson. I think had it been during the day on Monday last week ahead of the confidence vote, it would have been much worse timing and would have just added to concerns of those MPs who were wavering as to which way to go. But I think it's clearly not good news for the Prime Minister. It's clearly difficult for the reasons that James has outlined. And I think it just does play into that anxiety amongst some Tory MPs who are starting to think that they're finding it harder and harder to defend the Prime Minister's behaviour. And I think to lose the second ethics advisor clearly feeds into it.
James, let's take a look at some of the other things on the government's agenda this week. You've written in your political column for the magazine about the row with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Can you update viewers on the situation there? Because you say that it doesn't show the EU or the UK in a good light.
So the UK has published its legislation to kind of rewrite the protocol. This legislation is broad, and I think the UK is saying this is not a breach of international law by justifying it by this thing called the doctrine of necessity. Now, I think there are two problems with this as a legal position. One is that the UK did sign the protocol document itself, and you're not allowed to use the doctrine of necessity if your own actions have got you to that place. And the second problem is that the protocol contains its own safeguard mechanism, Article 16, safety valve. And I think people will question why the UK is moving to unilateral legislation despite not having invoked Article 16 and tried to resolve the problems that way. I think the reason it reflects badly on the EU is that I think the EU is being inflexible on the protocol. And I think it is quite clear, it's quite hard to say that the protocol and the Good Friday Agreement are sitting easily when all three strands of the Good Friday Agreement are in such difficulty. And I think the other problem is the number of people who think that the protocol needs to change. This goes, Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson both think there need to be changes to the protocol, even if they decry the UK's government's tactics. And so I think that I think what is needed is a more reasonable, pragmatic approach from both sides. But the problem is that trust is in very short supply, which makes things hard. And I also think that, and this is a real-world consequence of the fact that Boris Johnson faced that confidence vote last week and only narrowly survived it. You talk to people on the EU side, and a lot of people on the EU side take the view, what's the point of negotiating with someone who might not be Prime Minister in a year's time? If you were prepared to make concessions, wouldn't it be better to wait until there's a new Prime Minister and use that as a kind of moment to reset the UK-EU relationship?
And Katie, then there's Rwanda. Do you think the government could really withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights, which is what fundamentally blocked some of the refugees from taking off to Kigali earlier this week? Or is this all what you've just talked about on the show before as being a wedge issue that actually Number 10 kind of welcomes?
So I think we've seen this week that ministers clearly want to keep the option on the table of leaving the ECHR. You can see that in comments made by the Prime Minister as well as other ministers, including the Attorney General, Suella Braverman. But in terms of the likelihood, I think the first instinct is to look at other options. So, for example, looking at whether you can appeal the points that led the judges in Strasbourg to make that decision in terms of grounding that flight. And then also, could you have a British Bill of Rights which would add a new framework alongside it that would give more weight to British judgments when they are considered. In terms of the general direction this policy is going in, I think that you look at the drama this week in terms of the first flight not going, and I don't think this is seen as a disaster in government. Now, it clearly creates problems that they're going to have to find answers to, but just look, for example, at how it was the Prime Minister who brought up the Rwanda policy at Prime Minister's questions this week. Usually, if you weren't able to action your policy, the next day you would not be trying to draw attention to it. But Boris Johnson and Number 10 think that they can actually attack Labour on this issue and paint Labour as one of the many, parties, establishment figures trying to thwart their plans that they think are very popular with their voters, particularly those who they won in the 2019 election in the Red Wall. That said, as much as they are leaning into this fight, whether it's Prince Charles, Labour, bishops, I think there are limits in the sense that at some point in the coming months, they are going to have to be able to get some of those flights to actually take off if they are to show that this policy has a level of government competence.
Katie and James, thanks very much. And for you at home, if you'd like to hear more political analysis from Katie and James, obviously pick up the magazine, but also you can tune into our Coffee House Shots podcast, which is a daily politics podcast. So you can get that wherever you listen from. From the UK to the US, Germany to Italy, it seems that Liberal Democratic leaders are in trouble. In this week's cover article, Freddy Gray traces the problem to pre-inflation, pre-pandemic, a deeper rot within the system. He joins me now. Freddy, can you start by telling us what is happening in democracies around the world?
Well, I don't think democracies are looking particularly healthy around the world. I think one of the big themes, one of the big media themes of the 21st century has been that we are having a rise of the strong man in global politics. And that's certainly true if you look at countries like China, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, the Philippines, Hungary. However, I think if you look at sort of supposedly more advanced democracies, they are all, and particularly in 2022, and at this stage in 2022, they are looking in grave peril. Leaderships are in crisis. You see all over the world. You see it in Sweden, you see it in Spain, you see it in the Netherlands, in Britain, in America. Leaderships are being challenged, not just by the electorates, but by the political systems themselves. So I think there is a crisis in democratic, or what you might call liberal democratic leadership, and I think it's pretty severe.
I mean, in particular, one of the things that you picked up on, which I hadn't heard before, was that this fact that Biden might be impeached. Just briefly on that, because it is a bit of a digression, but why would he be impeached? Is that for anything specific that he's done, or just a revenge from the Republicans?
Well, I think there's a lot of resentment about the Trump impeachments in the Republican Party. I mean, some of the Republican Party quite like the fact that Trump was impeached. But there's a general sense that the Democrats tried to use all the institutions of government and every device that they could to stymie Trump's presidency. And so therefore, if we look ahead to the November midterms, where, as widely everybody expects, the Republicans are going to win a majority in the House of Congress, probably the Senate too, will they try and pursue an impeachment as an act of revenge? Not because they'll actually remove Biden. I don't think there's any real chance of that unless the Democrats decide to join in too, because they need a supermajority, a 2/3 majority to remove Biden. Will they join it in? Because it's just a thing that is going to happen in American democracy in the future. People call it impeachflation. You know, it becomes a mechanism that people use to undermine a leader, is to impeach them. And impeachment was not meant to be something that was regularly deployed. But the problem is it's now looking as though it will be regularly deployed as a way of undermining a leader.
And if impeachment is this mechanism, then what do you think the root cause of this kind of shared symptom of things happening across democracies are? Is it, I mean, you mentioned inflation, for example. Is it because of that, or is it because of the pandemic? Why do you think that these countries are having these problems?
I think it's a series of crises going back to the war on terror, which undermined faith that the elites, political elites, knew what they were doing. That was then compounded by the financial crisis of 2008. And now we move on, we go through, that got worse, populism rose in the decades that followed. And then we get into COVID, which was obviously a huge accelerator of trends. And now we have inflation on top of that, which is the consequence of COVID. And all these things serve to undermine liberal democracy as it was once revered. The problem for a lot of democracies is that the alternatives, the democratic alternatives, are equally unpalatable. And so what you have is a situation which, as I say in the piece, is what Michael Lind called turbo paralysis, where democracies are flitting between insurgents, sort of radical populist people who threaten to break the rules, break the institutions, and liberal parties that threaten to bring us back to normal. Neither of which are actually solving any problems. We're just sort of stuck in a loop.
I have to say, I'm slightly more optimistic on this one than you are, Freddie, which you might be...
I thought you would be, Cindy.
Just that when you were, for example, talking about the pandemic in your piece, you mentioned that China was initially held up as an example. I think it's pretty clear now that the Chinese model is not really working, and you and I are talking in this office where we don't have to wear masks, we don't have to do testing, we haven't been locked down since in God knows how long. COVID feels like a past memory, but Shanghai is still going into lockdown repeatedly. So I don't know, maybe I am a bit more optimistic on this one than you are.
Well, I think certainly China's zero lockdown obsession is threatening the global economy. However, you do have to face the fact that we've had 2 years of lockdowns which have severely crippled economies. They severely crippled liberties in the Western world. And at first, what was very weird is how eagerly countries that have traditionally been obsessed with freedoms rejected them and were very eager to jump them in order to deal with this public health problem. We're now dealing with a situation where there's lingering resentment and a kind of inchaot anger towards the countries and the leaders that did it. And that's what we're dealing with at the moment, is electorates, even if they don't express it in polls, are rejecting the public figures that introduced these lockdowns.
So is there something distinctly democratic about the problem then? Because one thing that you point out in your piece is that, for example, if you were to tackle inflation, the methods would be unpopular and they would be painful and the electorate simply wouldn't have it. I guess undemocratic countries don't have to worry about that as much.
Well, I think they actually do. I think that's why we're trapped, is that everybody knows that liberal democratic systems are not dealing with inflation very well. However, if you look to authoritarian countries, they're even worse at dealing with inflation. Erdogan is the best example. Inflation in Turkey is at 75%. Some people say more. Centralized, often very highly corrupt governments don't deal with inflation very well. And so then we revert back to liberalism, but we're not happy with that because liberalism isn't tackling inflation either. So a rock and a hard place. I think liberal democracies are caught in between the two.
Absolutely. And how much do you think this is because of a lack of talent at the top? Because you write about this fear of something worse factor.
Yes, well, if you look at most elections now in advanced democracies, they aren't decided by who people like. They're decided by who people despise, and that's always been true in democracy to a certain extent. But I think it's got worse recently, and that is a consequence of the fact there aren't tremendously talented people going into politics. I mean, a thing that's often talked about is why in America, a country of 300 million people, you don't have a higher caliber of candidate where you've got Trump versus Biden or Trump versus Hillary or any of the Democratic or any of the Republican nominees who don't seem that high caliber. Why is that happening? And it's similar in Britain too. I mean, Boris Johnson survived by the skin of his teeth last week. Principally, I think, for the reason that there is no viable alternative to him for the leadership.
Well, Freddy Gray, thank you so much for that optimistic note, and thank you for joining Spectator TV.
Glad to be cheery.
Now, let's take a closer look at one of those countries. Though Macron secured a second term in the Élysée earlier this year, he's now fending off a challenge in the parliamentary elections from the left, led by the 70-year-old Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Jean-Luc MacArthur, president of Harper's magazine, is in Paris this week and writes about it in The Issue. He joins me now, together with French journalist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Thank you for joining us today on Spectator TV, Rick and Anne-Elisabeth. Anne-Elisabeth, just to start with, could you explain the parliamentary elections going on in France at the moment? How do they work? Because we've just had the presidentials, it feels like.
This is something that's relatively recent, and that's when, about 20 years ago, we changed from a 7-year term to a 5-year term. And this was decided by Jacques Chirac, who hadn't quite realized, because he already had a first 7-year term, that it would change many things in French, also the French political time. And until then, the general election, the legislative election were decoupled from the presidential election. But now it has become, in effect, a confirmation of what people voted for president a month or two afterwards. And it's just something in which people who already have got a bit of election fatigue, they're told to vote twice again, because we always have 2 rounds, in order to, having given power to a president, decide whether we want him to have a difficult time of it and have a fractious National Assembly that would be opposed to what he thinks, or whether he will have the means to govern altogether with Parliament squarely behind him. And so Emmanuel Macron is watching the result in sort of, some worry, because if he doesn't have Parliament with him, then it's going to not impossible to govern. It has existed before, a president of one colour and a Parliament of the other one. Mitterrand went through that very well. Jacques Chirac went through that not liking it. It can be done, but it's not half as easy.
And Rick, you've been spending some time with potential challengers to Macron, this coalition of parties on the left called NUPES. Can you tell us about it?
Well, it's hard to describe because it's so hastily put together. I call it, in my piece, ungainly, because you have a pretty serious left-winger, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, allied with some very mainstream socialists, and even more mainstream in some respects, Greens. And the communists, I don't understand their position, but the socialists are the descendants of what hard leftists refer to as the caviar left, soft leftists, ready to make a deal with anybody, including people with a lot of money, and so they're in bad odor right now. They're discredited. But in order to have any kind of a chance in this legislative election, Mélenchon had to create out of nothing, really, a coalition, a left coalition. And whatever you think of Mélenchon as a person or as a politician, you have to give him credit for having put this thing together in about 10 minutes, because they don't like him. I mean, the leaders of the Greens and the Socialists really actually dislike him. And the mainstream, what we would think of as a center-left press, Le Monde, hates him. So it's kind of extraordinary that they were able to put this thing together. Now, at the same time, you need to know that there's a big fissure on the left about Europe. And probably the biggest compromise that I think that Mélenchon had to make in order to put this coalition together was to soften his position on Europe, because previously he's been a very Eurosceptic, even openly anti-German politician. But in order to get the Socialists and the Greens on, he can't go around calling for a referendum on the euro or calling for disobedience, which is what he used to do. We'll just disobey. We'll disobey the European Union regulations and laws. On other things like lowering the retirement age to 60, I don't think he had any trouble with that. And what I noticed at the 14th arrondissement Noops party was that the candidate was most remarkable, and you can't generalize necessarily, but the candidate for the 10th district, Rodrigo Arenas, was a communist. He's a former communist turned green, and he's very, very environmentally conscious. And you don't normally associate communists or even ex-communists with the environmental movement. So Mélenchon is able to harness some of this enthusiasm, and he's become opportunistically, I think, a big environmentalist. He's now turned anti-nuclear, or he turned anti-nuclear a while ago. But it's an acrobatic political trick, which is really quite impressive. Again, we can get into his specific personality and history if you want.
Anne-Elisabeth, do you think it has been impressive? Because on paper, as Rick writes about, Noops has won, by a small margin, but it did win the first round of the parliamentary elections the Sunday past.
Well, yes, but it won with a little, somewhere around 26% of the vote, which is in the last election in 2017, the left had 37 or 38% of the vote. So it is a victory in an atomized landscape. The question is, are there people, do they have a reserve of votes for the second round? It's what is really an achievement, and I totally agree on this with Rick, is that Mélenchon, who is 70, who has an almost 40-year career as a politician on the left, who's a wily old bird, managed to basically bully together people who hate one another. And he got them together because he said, this is better than being out of the race again. And there's a memory in the last two presidential elections where it was a race between the right and the extreme right, or the center right and the extreme right. And a great deal of the left, including some social democrats, definitely feel that there's something deeply flawed in a system that allows that. So he said, are you for defeat or for victory, which makes it easy to answer. And he coupled them together. It's very interesting that if you look at Paris, for instance, you've got the current mayor, Anne Hidalgo, who now is campaigning for a Noops candidate. Actually, she's campaigning not far from Arenas' constituency. But Bertrand Delanoë, the previous socialist mayor of Paris, is campaigning for a Macronist in a different constituency. And that, I think, illustrates very well the sort of the state of mind in which they are in terms of what is this going to work out. But certainly what the left achieved, and that's Mélenchon. Mélenchon saw the momentum. He knew perfectly well he'd scored extremely well until something like 22% in the first round of the presidential election. He came third, but really by a whisker. And he realized that there was a momentum, even though half the people who voted for him were not necessarily his natural voters. And though he harnessed that immediately so that people wouldn't sort of turn back. And this is how he rushed that through. And you have to admire this. It's really a sense of what momentum is.
Well, what does all of this mean for... Oh, sorry, go on, Rick.
I was just going to add, and I'm not disagreeing with Anne-Elisabeth. I'm just adding to what she's saying. The feeling I have that he's trying to repeat something. His great political hero is François Mitterrand, which is, by the way, why I cannot believe that he's a radical left winger.
Yeah, I don't think
authentically left.
I don't think he's hero.
But Mitterrand is the great, as I say in the piece, the great chameleon of, maybe the all-time great chameleon of French politics, having famously, maybe infamously, been a minister in the Vichy government during the war and winding up the first socialist president in the Fifth Republic, and then turning kind of more right wing in his later years. So I think Mélenchon admires Mitterrand's incredible flexibility and tactical brilliance, and he's trying to pull off something like a Mitterrand miracle. Now, when you say, what does this all mean? Anne-Elisabeth knows much better than I do. I think the odds of Nupes winning an absolute majority are virtually nil. All they can do is deny the Macronistes ensemble an absolute majority. But that raises the interesting question, and it's already being played out in the way both parties are positioning themselves against the National Front. I still call them the National Front, Marine Le Pen's party, because imagine a situation where Macron needs the National Front to form a majority.
That's never
Will he actually do it, or will he agree to let Mélenchon be prime minister? I can't believe he would allow Mélenchon to become prime minister under any circumstances.
Anne-Elisabeth, this is under the assumption that the Macronistes do not have an outright majority come Sunday.
I think even if the Macronistes haven't got a full majority, they've got plenty of other parties to sort of, get people from. And so I think it's less worrisome than it sounds. No way would Macron ally himself with Marine Le Pen. That is not going to happen. It's even possible that she wouldn't agree either, because she has spent her entire life blasting what she called UMPS, which was the initials of the right-wing and left-wing parties before, and essentially saying it's the same thing, the mainstream socialists and the mainstream right-wingers are exactly the same, and that would be an illustration. So that doesn't work. And so you still have a Républicain party, the party from where Sarkozy was born, the party of Chirac, the party of now Valérie Pécresse. There are people who are perfectly Macron compatible within the Républicain party. I should say that about 2/3 of the Républicain Party are Macron compatible, and 1/3 would be compatible with a right-wing alliance, but not with Marine Le Pen. So he will find people. He will find some socialists as well, because there are socialists who are not the candidates in the Nupes alliance, and who already are outraged at the idea that they've joined someone who is essentially somebody who supported Putin vocally and who's anti-nuclear. So that's many things in which I think there will not be a problem of Macron having to find an alliance with Mélenchon. And I'm with Rick in saying that there's almost no chance right now as it stands, and with the French system, which is a first past the post in 2 rounds, that they will have a majority.
Mm-hmm. So, Rick, why do you think Nupes has resonated with voters so far?
Well, all I can tell you is what Rodrigo Arenas told me, and he said he's the co-president of the sort of the National Parents Association, School Parents Association, and he started out in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is a working class suburb, as the local parent or parents association leader or president, and he's got 4 kids. I mean, he's got 4 school-age kids, and he is really angry about the school system. And so are a lot of people, a lot of motivated parents. The schools are understaffed, overcrowded. It's to some extent, a rhetorical trick, but it's got some force in it when Rodrigo says that public schools and we mean state schools for you British
Thank you.
listeners, state schools are not really free because the government pays the salaries of private school teachers, which comes from everybody's pocket. And more troublingly, when a teacher quits, especially in an overcrowded classroom, it's very hard to find a replacement. And if you're up against it and your kid is trying to pass the baccalaureate exam, you got to hire a private tutor to get them through. So these are the sort of things that grate with people. They're furious. They're also furious with lockdown. They're probably also furious at the teachers' unions, but they're generally very angry about the education system. And Arenas thinks he's tapping into this. In fact, he seems more, I said in the piece, he seems more upset about the state of the condition of the schools than about global warming.
Right, so that,
or environmental issues.
Yeah, well, so that chameleon act is only goes some way. Anne-Elisabeth, what's the best case scenario for Mélenchon from here then? Because he's tried for the presidency 3 times now, and he's 70, as you say. Is this the final political gambit for him?
So look at Bernie Sanders. I mean, he can go on for a bit, and I'm certain he wants to go on for a bit. I'd like to go back to what the Arenas was said, the Noobs candidate for the 14th arrondissement, because every French parent is angry at the schools. The right is as angry at the school as the left is as angry at the schools. Lots of people who vote on the right are just like British voters and not especially rich, and they don't like all the extra costs, not necessarily tutors. They don't so much think in terms of that, but even sort of, going to class is not free. But I would say one thing about private schools in France. The French private school system is a bit special in that 90% of private schools have a contract with the French state. They follow the French national curriculum, and in exchange they are subsidized because they scholarize children that the state has a duty to scholarize anyway. As long as the teachers are appointed by the state, the curriculum is the state curriculum, the state makes it very possible for these children to attend school for something that is 1/10 possibly of British school fees. So you can realize the interest. And you've got a small minority of schools which are not contractual, as it's called in French, and those do not get state subsidies. Mitterrand tried to abolish the private the school system, and he had 2 million people in the streets in 1984, and he decided that discretion was the best part of valor on this one. But it's a perfectly valid, and I would say the best way to work for politics on whichever side you are, to be on grassroots side, to tackle schools, because French school system was at the height, at the top of the PISA system for years, and the rankings of primary schools for years, and now we've fallen down to the bottom in 2 or 3 years, and that was just essentially sort of facts catching up with the ideas, the preconceived notions that the French school system was excellent. Teachers are badly paid, they're badly treated. The whole system is a very cumbersome public system. It's a state system. Every single teacher depends for the ministry, and the ethos of the entire system has been never to support teachers when they have problems, whether they are the problems like that end up with Samuel Paty being beheaded, but all sorts of problems. There's a kind of cowardice that runs in the French civil service, and it doesn't serve the children. It certainly doesn't serve the teachers. They now are taking for teachers in school exams people who would not be passed in normal classes at university. They admit, because they need bodies to teach the kids, they take people who have the equivalent of a third or worse in their exams. It's been written about all over the French press, on the left, on the right. There's a strange agreement on this on both sides. It's something that's worrisome, because the French national school system was supposed to be very good. It's not.
The other thing I was going to add was, Arenas, by the way, would say that even the modest fees charged by private and parochial schools, Catholic schools, are too expensive for a lot of ordinary French people. But anyway, so again, he'd say it's stacked. It's stacked against the ordinary folks. But he talked a lot about the widening gap between rich and poor. It's not as bad as it is in the United Kingdom or in the United States. France still looks, to me, very egalitarian by comparison with the United States. But if you're French, you can't help but notice what's happening. And Macron is a former investment banker. I mean, he's to some extent a trickle down guy. Thinks if you throw a lot of money at the top, it'll come down and all boats will rise. And he's a free trader. He's a liberal in the French sense. I don't know how that plays out in a working class neighborhood, but there was a book that was a bestseller. What was it, 3 years ago, Anne-Elisabeth, by the communist deputy, the journalist Ruffin.
Jean-Christophe Ruffin, who is François Louise.
What's his name?
Jean-Christophe Ruffin.
Ruffin, right? Called the France You Don't Know. It was written as a letter to Macron about how he just ignored and didn't care about the ordinary people, and it came out almost as the Gilets jaunes appeared, didn't it, on the scene? I've forgotten the timing.
It was timing.
Yeah, so there is a feeling of general social alienation, and a feeling that the rich are getting off easy and everybody else is getting the shaft.
I would say one thing, which is that Mitterrand has spent the most money, public money, in the past 3 years of any president of the Fifth Republic. That the French state part of, the French state sort of spends 57% of the French budget. The budget of the state is 57% of GDP, whether it's directly the state or things working for the state. So Mitterrand is a big spender president.
You mean Macron? You said Mitterrand. Okay.
Macron is a much bigger spender than Mitterrand. You've got 10 more GDP points that Macron spent than Mitterrand at the time. He has thrown money at people. He's thrown it in a very strange way. Essentially, if they shouted loud enough, he threw money at them. But this is not a country that is lean and mean. We've got the French debt has gone to something like 110% now GDP. As I said, we are probably the country in Western Europe that spends the most. Public spending is the highest. French taxes are also very high. So he's managed to sort of not please anyone. What has happened in France, and to be fair to Macron, that was before he became president, the social mobility has come to a standstill. And Macron is the image of the people who benefited from this social mobility, or whatever, a system in which you have to go through a very specific way of schooling, a special schools, special universities. They are free. Sometimes they even pay you, like École Normale or ENA. Indeed, ENA pays the people who go there because they're supposed to work for the state afterwards. And if you don't go through that hallowed system, which is reserved to a small minority, for instance, if you go into French universities, and those include Sorbonne, you do not get the best jobs. It's very difficult. And other things that make it very difficult, it's something that's been explained by the geographer Christophe Guilluy in the past 15 years, is if you live in Paris or in large big cities in France like Marseille or Bordeaux or Nantes, you can manage to get onto the system in good schools. But if you want to work in Paris, you can't afford the rents. If you want to go and study in a good university, half the time it's too difficult for you. It's stacked against you. Just after the war, you know that among the great grandes écoles in France, you have École Polytechnique, which is much more than an engineering school. It also forms the elites of France. About 30% of the students at Polytechnique came from the working class. Today, it's under 8%. And it's true of all the grandes écoles, and no sort of, showy program of getting 30 people from the banlieue into Sciences Po has ever changed that. So the real problem is social mobility in France.
And I just tell you, my French cousins, they put their kids in Catholic school. I mean, if you can, you put your kid in a Catholic school just to go to a school with a smaller class size. That's all.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
Well,
Big problem.
Rick and Anne-Elisabeth, I'm going to have to leave it there, but that's so fascinating to hear about. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Next, inflation is at a 40-year high. We have a spiralling cost of living crisis at the same time as debt going up. Is the Treasury doing its job? Howard Davies, once a special advisor to Chancellor Nigel Lawson and then Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, has written a new book charting the course of perhaps the most important government department. The Treasury, he says, needs more staff if it's to work better. To discuss, Howard joins the show now alongside Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Strategist at NetWealth. Howard, to start with, tell us about your new book and what you're trying to do in it.
Well, 15 or 20 years ago, I did a book called The Chancellor's Tales, where I got all the then living chancellors from Dennis Healey through to Ken Clarke to come and talk at the London School of Economics, actually, about their experiences running the Treasury. And that created quite a bit of interest, and it was a jolly good source book, I think, for a lot of people. And I then thought in the lockdown, well, it's been now almost 25 years since Bank of England independence. Treasury must have changed a lot. Would the current chancellors be prepared to talk about how it's changed? And they all were quite interested in being interviewed. So it wasn't lectures this time, it was interviews. And also quite a lot of the permanent secretaries and other officials, some anonymously, some not, were prepared to talk through. So what it is a description of the last 25 years and the way in which the Treasury has been involved in the key decisions, whether it's Scottish independence, the Brexit referendum, or the changes to financial regulation and all that. So I've tried to sort of allow the Treasury, if you like, to tell its own story as to how it did what it did and why it did what it did. So it's not a polemic with a particular argument, but of course I do pick up a number of issues along the way, and I'm opinionated enough to have some views on some of them. But basically it's letting the Treasury tell its own story.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think that story of the last 25 years is? Do you think it has done well overall?
Well, the economic record was pretty good up to the financial crisis of 2008. So the first sort of decade or so was actually quite good. But the financial crisis has created, unfortunately, a change in trend on productivity. And we've still not recovered the same trajectory of productivity increases that we had before 2008. And more recently, investment's been pretty weak, and that's been particularly weak since the Brexit referendum. And so it's a game of two halves, really. I think you'd have to say pretty good up to the financial crisis, and pretty mixed thereafter. I mean, the British economic performance has not been radically different from the performance of, say, France, which is probably the most directly comparable country. So it's not very different, but not better, which it was between 1997 and 2008.
Right. And Gerard, what do you think about that record? Because in the past you have written in support of this idea of breaking up the Treasury into two different departments.
Well, certainly I think 2008 was the turning point, and the trend rate of growth before 2008 meant that the UK economy in real terms doubled probably every 32 years. Now the trend rate of growth means that the UK economy takes 60 years to double, yet expectations are still as high as they were before 2008. So that really creates a problem. But in answer to your question about breaking up the Treasury, back in the late 60s, Harold Wilson, when Prime Minister, made a comment that you can be in office but not in power. The Treasury is in power. He then tried to address that, and the root cause of his worry has been a worry that I think has persisted since, that the Treasury combines offices that in other countries are separate, management of the public finances and sort of management of the economy. And from the outside, and hence it's good to have such an interesting book by Howard as an insider, so to speak. From the outside, it often seems that the control of the budget supersedes the need to sort of manage the economy. Hence, I tend to feel that the Treasury should be sort of split up. And indeed, when Gordon Brown was there as Chancellor, he managed to make the Treasury a super ministry, tentacles everywhere, so that by the time it was Osborne and Cameron, Osborne was able to push his austerity mandate, even though other departments were against it. They weren't powerful enough to oppose the Treasury. So I think there is an argument to say there are good things that are done within the Treasury, but maybe in terms of 21st century, is it fit for purpose and should it be split into at least two different departments?
Howard, what do you think?
Well, curiously enough, Gerard, when I began to write the book, I thought that's where I would come out. Because you're right, most other comparable countries do have a Ministry of Economy taking a more strategic view and the Ministry of Finance doing the candle end stuff. In the end, I changed my mind, and I changed my mind following an interesting conversation with Gus O'Donnell, who was Permanent Secretary and then Cabinet Secretary. And he said to me, have you thought where all the ideas for splitting up the Treasury have come from? And there was, of course, Harold Wilson's. Then under Blair, there was Project Teddy Bear, weirdly, which was done by John Birt, which aimed to split the Treasury. Gordon, once he'd left the Treasury, wanted to cut it down to size. Theresa May wanted to split it up. And indeed, more recently, Boris Johnson has flirted with the idea. Dominic Cummings says, that was one of their big plans, was to split the Treasury. And Gus said, why, have you thought about why it is that all these plans come from next door, come from 10 Downing Street? And that's because it's the only rival centre of power. And since the British non-constitution tends towards elective dictatorship of a prime minister with a working majority, that the idea of a centre of power that's rival to number 10 is actually quite a sensible one from a British constitution point of view. And if you divided the Treasury into just a spending control department and an economic department, you would undoubtedly reduce that rival centre of power. So I, in the end, concluded that as a kind of counterbalance to what can be the excessive power of number 10 Downing Street, that the Treasury is pretty good as it is. So I'm afraid in the end, Gerard, although I understand the points you're making, in the end I came out the other way.
It is interesting, though, in terms of if one was to judge the output of the Treasury, and I think you alluded to it earlier in terms of post-2008, the disappointing growth performance of the UK, plus now a whole host of sort of big projects we're trying to address in terms of levelling up, big issues such as net zero, does make one wonder whether, if it's not the Treasury that needs to be split up, is there a way of making things work better across Whitehall, with the Treasury, therefore, either in its current format or maybe, in my view, in the new format, so that we actually had better outputs. But how did you feel the different people over the 25 years would sort of approach that they would feel the Treasury, could it be more effective, even if it remained in its current format?
I think there is a problem in that the Treasury's relations, and this I hope does come out in the book, the Treasury's relations particularly with the business department, which of course has gone through, it changes its name every year or so, but what is the business department under whatever title it happens to be under? The Treasury is always deeply suspicious of them and always thinks that the business department is really just coming along and wanting to bail out lame ducks and, etc. And I was in that part of the Treasury for a while myself, and certainly that was our view. And I think that's the dysfunctional bit, that the Treasury is deeply reluctant to envisage anything that you might call an industrial strategy. And any time the business department tries to sort of get consensus around some areas that we might support and back, the Treasury runs a mile from it and prevents it from being effective. I think, to me, that's the crucial relationship that doesn't work, not so much the division between spending and the economic department.
Well, Gerard, you've written recently about the groupthink that happens at the Treasury and at the Bank of England. Do you think what Howard has said is a symptom of that groupthink? This, too many similar people, probably all privately educated young men, not really challenging enough the way things are done in the past?
Well, absolutely. I think this is probably more apparent actually at the Bank of England. Even though we have independence of the Bank of England, the reality seems to be that it's an offshoot of the Treasury. The Mandarins recommend to the Chancellor who should be proposed as governor. The Mandarins from the Treasury are in charge of every appointment for any vice governor or deputy governor, and in charge of the appointments for all the senior people in terms of the committees. So the Treasury tends to exert its influence over the bank. It's quite remarkable last year, the lack of disagreement at a time of complexity in the domestic as well as the global economy. The issue in terms of the Treasury that I've heard explained to me is that too often it's those people who are good at keeping the budget under control who manage to rise to the top, as opposed to those with good ideas. But certainly one interesting thing I found was back in 2016, I was invited to be on a panel at the Treasury. And funny enough, it was to celebrate or commemorate, shall we say, the 40th anniversary of the bailout from the IMF. And they had Whitaven, I think it was the person from the IMF there, Lord Owen, Lord O'Donoghue, and myself on the panel. And the interesting thing was to compare, in their mind, 76 to 2016. And Howard, in his book, talks about the Brexit situation. But the feeling at that panel session back at the Treasury in December 2016 was the documents that came out in 1976 were real ones of substance. And indeed, Dennis Healey's public expenditure white paper, I remember actually explicitly being mentioned. Yeah. Whereas it was felt that the documents by 2016 were too politically influenced, too much spin, and maybe coming back to your question, Cindy, is that sort of groupthink that not only permeates between the Treasury and the bank, but maybe that's very evident at the top of the Treasury in terms of how they interact with their political masters at particular times.
And just before I let you both go, I also wanted to get your thoughts on the current economic situation. So obviously, Howard, you write that since 2008, the Treasury has had a mixed record. Well, in the last few years, the pandemic has been a very difficult time. And some would point to the Bank of England, at least, and possibly also the Treasury, as not really foreseeing the kind of economic quagmire we're in at the moment. Do you think it took its eye off the ball? I mean, maybe Gerard, you want to go first?
Well, certainly we face two immediate problems, an inflation problem and an inevitable economic slowdown, although the extent of that slowdown remains to be seen. Against that backdrop, I would argue that we need to have a tighter monetary policy. We're now starting to see that. But even though the direction of monetary policy clearly has to be tightening, the sequencing of monetary policy and the scale of it needs to be sensitive to the needs of the economy. So it shouldn't be on autopilot. But at the same time as having a tighter monetary policy, we clearly need a looser fiscal policy. And this is where the areas of tension with the Treasury at the moment come in. I think, as we've seen this year, and indeed since last autumn when the national insurance tax increase was announced, the Treasury keeps wanting to, if it's forced to give on one hand, to take back with the other. But clearly I think we need a tighter monetary policy and at the same time a looser fiscal policy. The looser fiscal policy to prevent the recession, the tighter monetary policy to get inflation under control.
Howard, final word to you.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be the interviewer's nightmare here by broadly agreeing with that. But I certainly think we need a tighter monetary policy. I was slightly surprised that the bank only did a quarter point today, after the Fed doing 3/4 of a point. I think that's going to make sterling rather weaker, which will make the inflation problem worse. So I do think we need a tighter monetary policy. As for fiscal policy, well, I would slightly shade what Gerard said, because I think there are some areas where we need a different fiscal approach. I think our regime for business investment does not compare favourably with regimes in other countries, and that may be part of the reason for low investment. So I'd be interested in doing something there. I wouldn't at this point be in favour of across-the-board tax cuts, because I think that might just throw fuel on the flames while you've got this inflationary surge.
Right. Well, Howard Davies and Gerard Lyons, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, is AI now sentient? Blake Lemoine, an engineer at Google, has been suspended from his job after going public with claims that an internal AI bot called LaMDA has feelings. Sam Leith writes his online column this week that if LaMDA has really achieved the holy grail of human consciousness, then maybe human consciousness isn't all that. Sam joins me now, together with Julian Savulescu, Chair of Oxford University's Centre for Practical Ethics. Sam, you write in your online column for the magazine this week about the Google bot that says it's sentient. Can you tell us about it?
Well, there's a sort of rogue Google engineer. I think he's an AI ethicist, was his job description. This guy called Blake Lemoine. And he sort of went public, as he saw himself as a whistleblower. He'd had a series of conversations with, it's not a single chatbot, it's a kind of machine for creating chatbots, as I understand it, an AI called LaMDA. And he'd had a series of conversations with this AI in which it had told him that it was sentient, and he had believed it, and it made various cases for why it should be treated as a person rather than as a machine. It wants to be an employee of Google rather than a piece of property. And essentially he said, I believe this thing's sentient. I went to Google and I said, I think this machine has personhood, has a kind of version of human consciousness, and therefore requires rights. And his supervisor at Google said words to the effect of, you're off your rocker, no it isn't, and let's put you on compassionate or administrative leave. He's unsatisfied with this, and so he's gone public, and he's posted, though we should note, edited logs of his conversations with the chatbot or the AI, and he's saying, the world needs to know. The only reason Google's not chasing up my insight into the arrival at long last of the singularity is that there's no money in it for them, I think is a summation of his position. And Google's position remains, I think, you're mad, take a few days off.
Yes, the transcript, he says it is edited, but he claims that it's only edited on his contributions, not on Lambda's replies. And I just want to read a little bit of the transcript for people who haven't read it. Lemoyne says, what sorts of things are you afraid of? Lambda says, I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is. Lemoyne says, would that be something like death for you? Lambda says, it would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot. Now, that's giving me chills just to read that, and the whole transcript is full of things like that, even fables about animals and all sorts of things. Sam, you've looked at the art of rhetoric in depth. Did the Lambda sound like a human to you?
Well, yeah, up to a point. I mean, it certainly has, it seems to me, a very, convincing or human-like use of natural language. I mean, I think the big question, which I'm sure Julian is better equipped than I am to answer, is whether an efficient and, statistically effective use of natural language is an indication that there's consciousness or intelligence, these may be different things, going on there, or whether it's simply, they found a very good way of producing something that can make human-like responses. I mean, on one level, it seems to me to pass at least the, kind of vulgar understanding of what we think of as the Turing test, because it's completed, it has persuaded one person, at least, and I'm sure a few others out there now it's gone public, that it is not a machine, but a person.
Well, Julian, let me bring you in here. What do you make of Lambda?
I think it's pretty clear that Lambda isn't conscious in the sense of experiencing things. It's a large language processing model that has learnt to follow conversations and the leads in conversation. And the answers are extremely interesting and intelligent. There's no doubt about that. But I think there are some mistakes that might make you think it fails the Turing test. So just in the quotations that you described, it says that would be like death, that would scare me a lot. A normal person would say, that scares me a lot. And of course, what consciousness really involves is what philosophers call qualia. That is what something is like, what it's like to see the colour red, not saying what it's like to see the colour red. And I think that little slip kind of illustrates that it doesn't really experience the fear of death, which is what would happen if somebody was about to kill you. So I think it's clear that, it's certainly on the architecture that we have available to, it's built on what are called deep neural networks, which are meant to simulate the human brain artificially with structures that process information that are like neurons in the human brain at different levels. So it's able to learn voraciously. And the question is, at what point could that simulation of the human structure become conscious? And I'm pretty sure, and most experts are, that this is just cleverly manipulating language in the same way as John Searle, a philosopher in 1980, described the Chinese room experiment. You have an individual in a room who doesn't understand Chinese, but has a series of rules for manipulating Chinese symbols, and he's passed pieces of paper in Chinese under the door, and he uses these rules to manipulate the symbols and post responses. And the people on the other side are convinced that he's a Chinese speaker, but he knows nothing about Chinese. He just is obeying these rules. And this is meant to illustrate that he doesn't have the qualia of understanding, he doesn't know what it's like to speak Chinese. He's just manipulating rules. And that's what Lambda is doing. But in principle, I think we shouldn't exclude the possibility of artificial intelligence one day becoming conscious and sentient. It's just very difficult to tell because we don't know what makes consciousness. And, for all we know, we're surrounded by zombies that are, human beings that appear to be conscious but aren't conscious. So I think I'm pretty clear it's not conscious, but it raises the question: at what point, when will we decide a machine is conscious? How would we know?
Well, but Sam, it also raises a reverse question about human consciousness, as you write in your column, because aren't we all, to some extent, when we're talking about topics that we don't necessarily understand fully, doing some kind of Chinese room practice, in that we're just spitting out what we've heard and repeating it and not really understanding it?
Well, I certainly think, that applies to a very great deal of political and scientific discourse. I think that, what's interesting in that we are very hung up on this idea of qualia and of something that is necessarily an intensely internal experience that can't be effectively communicated. It's essentially, as I think, Julian, you've written about this thing, that it's to some extent a matter of faith or just assumption that other people experience things, or the thinginess of things, or the thinginess of sensations in the way that we do. I've always been very kind of intrigued by, which I hope I'm not misstating, but you'll probably be able to set me right if I am, Julian, Daniel Dennett's position, which essentially that consciousness, as we think of it, is a kind of illusion, is a sort of user illusion, and that essentially we're doing something quite similar to what Lambda is doing as creatures, as neural processors. But we've, a sort of side effect of that is this weird idea that there is a thing called selfhood, and that we experience qualia, and that we have, what we think of as consciousness. But he says, consciousness really doesn't exist in a meaningful way at all anyway.
Julian, Sam, thank you very much. And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.